Welcome to the deep dive. What if the very things we feel are emotions are actually a fundamental form of logic, a primal information system that shapes our social world in ways we rarely consider?
It's a really fascinating perspective, yeah. It's drawn from this concept called the Infology of Emotions, which, we've been exploring through quite a stack of sources, some thought-provoking articles, dialogues with AI, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Right, and our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack this idea. We want to look at our emotional lives, our social world, through this, well, unique lens of infology,
Yeah.
understanding how these feelings as logic connect to everything from like our first cries as babies all the way up to complex political systems.
And pull out the most surprising, maybe the most useful insights from looking at it this way.
Exactly. What does it really mean to view emotions as information?
Well, let's dive in and see.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The most foundational idea from this perspective is emotions aren't just, fluffy feelings. They're a primitive, nonverbal language.
That's the core of it. I mean, think about life before words. How do living things communicate really fundamental needs, states?
Right.
You've got facial expressions, sounds, postures, even smells.
Right.
This is communication at its most basic level, ancestor to descendant.
Like a baby crying.
Exactly. A baby cries, not just because it's, say, sad in our complex sense, but to signal, I need something right now. Pay attention.
So emotions are they're timely actions, things the organism does that require a response from others.
Precisely. And the source material puts it quite powerfully in that primal sense, no emotion, no event.
Meaning if there's no outward emotional
Yeah.
signal.
Others might not even register that something significant is happening to that organism. These signals, okay, they might be what the source calls mixed messages, not perfectly clear, maybe a bit ambiguous,
Sure.
but they are infinitely better than silence when it comes to basic survival, basic interaction, way before we had language.
And this nonverbal language, this is sort of the bedrock then. Something more complex builds on top of it.
That's exactly the idea. As organisms, especially humans, evolved, that need for communication drove us towards systems with, well, higher and higher levels of clarity, unambiguity.
Like verbal language.
Verbal language, yeah. And eventually leading to the incredible precision of something like, say, mathematics. Words like tree, run, water. They carry a specific shared meaning. Pretty unambiguous.
But okay, language didn't just leave emotion behind, did it? It sort of transformed it, which is where this concept of emotonyms comes in.
Yes, this is a really key idea in this framework. Emotonyms. They're words that don't carry objective, measurable information in that same precise way.
Okay.
They carry perception
Yeah.
or attitude. They're kind of like emotions embedded in words.
So saying something is warm or good or tasty, beautiful,
Perfect examples.
or even describing a quantity as plenty.
Exactly. Their meaning is subjective, isn't it? It's tied to individual perception. Plenty doesn't give you a number. It tells you the speaker feels it's a lot.
And the critical difference this whole framework highlights is
Well, unambiguous terms allow for precise logical operations, like in science or engineering. You can calculate things.
right.
You can't do precise calculations with emotonyms. If someone says that's a good deal, you can't multiply good by 3. You need objective facts, numbers.
Okay, so if emotions are this fundamental, maybe slightly ambiguous information system, and they stick around in language as these emotonyms, is that ambiguity just a flaw? Or does it actually do something else?
This is where it gets really interesting. The source material suggests that the very ambiguity of this emotional language, the need to guess the reasons behind a signal, is actually what creates intrigue.
Intrigue. How so?
Our brains are kind of wired to decode these signals to figure out why. Why the expression? Why the tone?
So messages that don't have emotion feel weird, less engaging. Like the source says, food without spice.
Exactly like that. We're naturally drawn to figuring out why someone feels a certain way or why something seems good or bad. And this drive to decipher intrigue, it goes beyond just people. The source argues it fuels our fascination with unpredictability in the world, and our appreciation for art, which often relies on ambiguity, tension, multiple interpretations.
And if you take that drive too far, that need to decipher intrigue, even when there isn't really a clear signal.
Well, the source suggests it can lead people to find patterns or conspiracies where none actually exist, applying that powerful decoding mechanism inappropriately because we crave resolution to something that feels ambiguous, even if it isn't.
What about humor? Does that fit in here?
Yeah, the source views humor as a specific way we resolve intrigue. You build up ambiguity, or expectation.
The setup.
Right, the setup. And then the punchline, the resolution, is often surprisingly, maybe even absurdly obvious. It's like a playful release of that decoding tension.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. One of the most maybe provocative ideas here is how emotion connects directly to, well, credibility, to how important we think information is.
It's a powerful insight, isn't it? From this perspective, if someone describes something significant, something important, but without any emotion, it can unconsciously signal that maybe they don't genuinely believe what they're saying.
Because a normal
A
organism.
normal organism, yeah, reacting to something important should express some emotion.
Mm.
The source repeats this idea. There is an emotion, there is an event, meaning the emotion signals perceived significance.
And this can make us automatically trust someone, almost without really analyzing their argument.
Pretty much.
Right.
Because generating genuine emotion in response to something, it's largely automatic. It actually takes effort to fake it well or to completely hide it.
Right.
So we seem to be wired to see genuine emotion as a reliable signal that the information being conveyed is real, it's important. We assume the emotion is authentic, so we assume the message must be too.
Which, of course, opens the door right up to the abuse of emotionality.
Absolutely. Since we have that automatic tendency to trust emotion, it can be exploited, manipulated. By presenting emotional messages, but with distorted context, or maybe no real context at all, someone can make something pretty insignificant feel incredibly important. Or they can fake authenticity to mislead you.
Like, using those emotonyms, we talked about those positive feeling words in a political slogan. Kind, responsive, attentive, but without giving any actual concrete evidence.
That's a classic example the source uses, yeah. It leverages our positive feeling towards those words to create a sense of trust, but without any factual basis for it. No record, no results.
Just the feeling.
Just the feel. Now, the source does note a positive side, too, when it's not malicious. Emotional, intriguing messages can be a really powerful and, frankly, entertaining way to learn. Think about art, storytelling.
Okay, and what about swearing? The source mentions Matt. How does that fit?
Right, Matt? The source sees it not as inherently bad words, but as a level of emotionality. It's like shouting, linguistically. It's the tool you reach for to convey the most intense emotions. So banning it, in this view, isn't just banning words. It's essentially an attempt to police or suppress the expression of very intense emotion itself. It carries weight because it's the verbal equivalent of a primal yell or roar.
Wow. Okay, let's move on to how this infology gets embedded in us, like from childhood. The source argues humans aren't born intelligent, right? But with the potential for it, which gets developed through learning.
And that learning process, right from the very start, is heavily based on emotional programming. From parents, ancestors, the whole environment.
How does that work?
Parents use emotional responses, approval, disapproval, smiles, frowns, tone of voice, to teach kids not just language, but crucial social priorities. Norms, what's good, what's bad, what matters in this group.
So the amount of emotional approval we get for doing certain things literally programs what seems desirable or undesirable to us. It sets our priorities.
That's the core idea, yeah. What gets positive emotional feedback becomes a high priority goal. And this whole process builds what the source calls conscience.
Conscience, but not in the usual sense, maybe. More like an internalized set of these emotional priorities and norms, creating a sort of virtual society inside your head.
Exactly that. It's an internal system for evaluating your own actions, even when you're totally alone, based on the programming you receive from your environment, your upbringing. The person is described as basically a complex logical calculator.
Okay.
But the criteria it uses for evaluation, the values it calculates against, are heavily influenced by this social emotional programming.
This view gets pretty deep, especially when it talks about desires. The source makes this statement that really stops you in your tracks.
That really does. The claim that almost no one has their own unique desires, that we're largely fulfilling other people's will.
Whoa.
It views society's influence, parents, peers, culture, as almost like God's walking beside you, constantly shaping what even seems desirable in the first place.
You mean you can't truly want something that no one else could potentially appreciate socially? It wouldn't even register as interesting or worth wanting.
That's the argument. Our desires seem to need that potential for external validation, for social appreciation, to even form properly.
So in this framework, what is the fundamental purpose of life if our desires aren't entirely our own?
It boils down to obtaining social approval and self-approval. But that self-approval is based on those internalized principles, that conscience programmed by society.
So the core drive is seeking positive reactions from others and from that inner virtual society.
That seems to be the engine, yes, seeking those reactions.
And what about selfishness? How does that fit?
Well, it gets reframed quite radically, not as acting purely for oneself against others, but maybe as too much active altruism.
Altruism.
Because we pursue goals that were programmed into us by society, which is sort of altruistic in the sense of fulfilling society's objectives. But we believe we're acting selfishly. We're just energetically implementing learned societal goals, serving the internalized gods, so to speak.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. Now, how do we take all this input, the emotional signals, the words, the social programming, and actually build our understanding of the world? The source talks about internal models of the world, right? For animals and humans.
Yeah, think of that baby antelope example it gives. It doesn't have an innate fear of that specific predator shake. It builds a model based on observation danger signals from others, the predator's behavior, the outcome.
And those models let it make predictions, like that shape means run.
Exactly. Reliable predictions for survival.
In humans, we have this incredible advantage because we can share these models using language.
Absolutely. Unambiguous words, the precise terms, they convey clear representations of the world model. This lets us transmit accumulated knowledge across generations, a huge advantage.
And the emodonyms.
They, again, convey the perception or the attitude towards those representations in the model, like that part of the model is dangerous or good.
But the source is pretty critical of how we often learn in modern society, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It argues that traditional schooling often rewards, rote repetition, just getting the right answer for the test or the grade.
Rather than building robust internal models that can actually make reliable predictions about the real world.
Exactly. And this, the source argues, can lead to logical inconsistencies inside a person's understanding. It even leads to this provocative concept of outwardly normal, stupid people.
Whoa, what does that mean?
The optimum debilis, or superficial majority, people who can function socially, hold conversations, seem normal, but lack deep logical application. Their internal models might be shaky, inconsistent, not great for reliable prediction outside familiar contexts.
And this ties into a specific kind of error it calls terminological stupidity, or teachability.
Yes, teprability. It's described as this socially trained habit of using those ambiguous emotonyms like freedom, justice, fairness, as if they were precise, unambiguous terms within a logical argument.
Ah, so people argue past each other because they're using fuzzy words as if they were mathematical terms?
Precisely. They haven't defined their terms, so the logic breaks down. It leads to arguments that just go in circles.
The source also makes a distinction between different kinds of intelligence.
Right. It talks about individual intellect. That's your ability to build reliable predictions for your own life, predict how others will react, integrate into society effectively.
Okay.
And then species intellect. That's more about the collective ability, the social system, the whole group, to function as a unit, survive, make predictions as a species, resist external threats like nature.
And just to tie this section off, how is truth defined in this whole infology framework?
It's defined very pragmatically, simply as a reliable prediction.
That's it, not about absolute reality or anything.
Nope. It's not about who said it or if it matches some ultimate reality. It's just, does this piece of information allow you to make a prediction that actually holds true in the world? Does it work?
But reliable sources are still important.
Oh, definitely. Because information from a source that has historically provided reliable predictions is, statistically, more likely to give you another reliable prediction. But the ultimate test is the reliability of the prediction itself.
Okay, so if our internal models and our desires are so heavily shaped by this emotional programming and our trust is kind of wired to respond to emotion, how does all this play out in bigger social structures, like authority and even faith?
Yeah, this lens offers some really deep, maybe uncomfortable insights here.
Mm-hmm.
Authority, fundamentally, is seen as an accumulator of social approval.
Accumulated approval.
Think way back, the earliest leaders, maybe the alpha coordinating the pack, they gained influence through collective emotional support, what we might call charisma today. That support allowed them to coordinate the group.
And then as society got more complex, people started specializing.
Exactly. Authority became relative. You have the authority of the skilled hunter, the authority of the elder who remembers things, the authority of the tool maker. Different people accumulated approval for different skills.
And this allowed for division of labor.
Right. And eventually, with things like money, you get away for this Accumulated approval, economic success, for instance, to translate across different kinds of activities, approval becomes a bit like currency.
And someone who has authority, who's accumulated that social approval, their opinion just carries more weight. It's almost perceived as being the collective opinion.
It pretty much is, yeah. This is why authority figures are so influential. Their statements come implicitly backed by all the perceived approval they command. It feels heavier, more significant.
But the system is fragile or complicated.
Oh, definitely ripe for complication
Mm.
and abuse.
Like what?
Well, a major one is malicious imitation, creating a convincing appearance of widespread social approval for one
You
person,
know, through media.
often through controlling or synchronizing authoritative media sources, yes, making it look like everyone agrees with this person or idea. Then that person's personal opinions can be presented, and more importantly accepted, as the consensus of the entire society.
That sounds incredibly powerful.
It is. And history gives us some pretty scary examples of where that can lead herd behavior, following charismatic figures even when their ideas are destructive. The Hitler example is mentioned.
And the source links this to having fewer specialized authorities, like if power gets too concentrated.
Yes. When you don't have strong, diverse, respected authorities in many different fields, science, arts, ethics, whatever, then a single supreme authority can push through really radical changes or maintain a very rigid social conservatism without much informed challenge. People just defer. Baseless claims to titles or expertise become just minor issues in that context.
Okay, what about faith? Is that just seen as believing things without any evidence at all?
The source offers a slightly different angle. It sees faith not necessarily as a lack of analysis, but as an analysis that prioritizes the source of the information, the authority over the information's utility for making reliable predictions.
So the question is, who said it before does it actually work?
Exactly. It's often faster and easier to just trust the designated authority. And socially, aligning with authority is frequently rewarded, right? Think about school agreeing with the teacher often gets you further than questioning them, even if your question is valid.
But the huge problem there is authorities aren't always right. And this approach prioritizes pleasing the authority figure over actually building your own reliable predictive models of the world.
That's the danger. People internalize the authority's view, and if it doesn't quite make sense or match reality, they might assume the problem is their own lack of understanding, not that the authority could be wrong. The information feels somehow unattainably high or complex.
And this leads to passing down information that isn't necessarily the most useful.
Right. The source suggests civilizations often pass down the most authoritative information. The stuff connected to the most powerful figures or traditions, not necessarily the information that is most useful or provides the most reliable predictions. It's one explanation for why ancient, less functional theories or beliefs, like religious dogma described as ancient science forbidding objections, can persist for so long.
And this creates what the source calls a faithful majority.
According to this view, yeah. Modern education, it argues, often cultivates this by rewarding alignment with the taught material, with the authority. The faithful majority tends to trust the source, who said it matters most, rather than rigorously testing whether the information works to make reliable predictions.
In contrast to a doubting minority.
These are the individuals who, maybe because of their upbringing, their environment, or just their disposition, prioritize the usefulness and predictive power of information above all else.
They're more likely to question.
Much more likely to question, to challenge, to innovate. They doubt that premise that everything important has already been invented, or that authority always knows best.
So how do we encourage more of that? How do we cultivate critical thinking, what the source calls the technology of doubt?
Well, the source suggests we can actually be trained to question more effectively. This involves things like being exposed to incorrect information, maybe presented with intrigue.
Like a puzzle?
Sort of. And then seeing the errors admitted and corrected. Going through that process helps train our own logical models. It builds resistance to misinformation, reduces that susceptibility to blindly accepting useless authoritative information, what the source bluntly calls stupidity, derived from bad info.
So it's about learning how to evaluate information, not just memorizing what information the authorities say is true.
Exactly. Building the skills to assess reliability yourself.
And what about for collective decisions, like in politics? How does this play out?
Well, the source argues that an unqualified majority people, without specific training in the complexities of, say, social science or economics, will often just default to trusting the most apparent authority figure or the loudest voice.
In the doubting minority.
They might see the flaws, but often just follow the majority decision as a practical local norm to keep the peace or get along.
So the source suggests.
It controversially suggests that for really complex societal issues, maybe a qualified majority, those with proven expertise and reliable predictive models in the relevant fields might be a more effective decision-making body than a simple majority vote among people untrained in that specific subject matter.
Okay, bringing it back down to the individual level again, these internalized principles, the ones programmed by our upbringing and then maybe sanctioned by authority figures, these become the basis for our values, right?
And differences in these values between groups can become principled differences, really deep divides, when an authority emphasizes them. Precisely. An authority figure, or even just the imitation of authority through media, can take existing differences and elevate them into defining principles. This creates what's perceived as public opinion and helps guide that superficial majority we talked about.
And these core principles, they mostly come from our ancestors, but they can change.
They can, yeah. But according to this model, it usually requires either a really strong logical basis becoming widely accepted, or, more commonly, an explicit sanction from a powerful authority, or maybe a formal collective decision like a vote.
Which means unity in this framework. What does that actually mean?
It's defined pretty starkly as simply having the same conclusions on these fundamental social values. Shared beliefs about core issues historically, it could be religious tenets, maybe even something like skin color being a principal difference, sadly. Today, maybe political ideologies, cultural norms. That shared agreement defines the boundary of social unity.
Wow. Okay, this framework seems to touch on, well, almost everything in society. The source material lists a whole bunch of other concepts viewed through this lens. Can we just briefly touch on a few more, like activity or naming?
Sure, activity, for instance, is largely defined by social opinion, by how it's named. The difference between rest and work might be more about the title and social perception than the actual physical effort involved. Balanced variety is seen as key.
And naming itself.
Naming or giving something a title is seen as a powerful information container. It packages assumed or real context. Think about calling someone who won a questionable election president. If influential authorities and media consistently use that title, it helps legitimize them in the public mind, regardless of the underlying reality.
Okay. What about something really personal, like love?
The source defines love quite clinically, actually, as a strong, often rare, fortunate attitude or conclusion towards a situation, a person, or even yourself. It's seen as a positive outcome you arrive at, something that can't really be forced, though you can try to improve the conditions for it. And of course, it acknowledges it's heavily exploited by writers and artists.
And happiness.
Described as actively cultivating your environment, both your internal state and the external reactions you get, almost like tending a garden, finding satisfaction in that process. Also, simply being with friends, doing things you genuinely enjoy.
Treason. That sounds purely social.
Exactly. Described purely as a social aspect, its meaning defined entirely by societal opinion. The feeling of offense, if you're accused or betrayed, comes from internalizing the negative views of others within that society. A confession, in this view, forces the other person involved, say a spouse, to confront those harsh internalized societal judgments directly.
This framework even gets into things like politics of opportunity.
Yeah, described rather starkly. Groups or countries using their capability, their force, mainly for influence or income, not necessarily for the overall utility or benefit of the larger system. It's framed almost like an autoimmune reaction within the species-level organism.
An autoimmune reaction.
Yeah. The source even makes some pretty radical suggestions based on this, like eventually removing permanent armed forces and long-lived leaders globally, but only after achieving equal infrastructure and legal systems worldwide. The goal being better species survival against external threats like, say, space weather.
And the way we get information today? Like internet feeds?
Critiqued for a lack of hierarchy and specialization of information. Unlike older, maybe more curated sources like encyclopedias or specialized journals, current feeds tend to mix everything together, vital scientific info alongside trivial entertainment misinformation.
Which could lead to
A potential decline in the collective intellectual level, the source worries. It suggests maybe trying to separate hierarchical, validated scientific or expert information from general entertainment feeds more clearly.
term limits for officials. What's the take there?
Seen pragmatically, not as a guarantee of finding the best leaders, but as a useful guarantee of eventually removing the worst ones, preventing them from staying entrenched indefinitely.
And finally, this idea that everyone is disabled, what's that about?
It's not meant negatively. It's about the division of labor. In a complex society, everyone specializes. That means everyone is disabled in the sense that they lack the skills needed for survival outside their specialty. We're all dependent on others. The norm isn't being universally capable, it's being useful at something specific within the system.
Okay, that's a huge amount of ground covered. Let's try and bring this all back home, connect these pieces back to you, the listener. How might looking at the world through this sometimes challenging lens of the infology of emotions, how might it change how you see everyday things?
Well, think about those arguments you get into sometimes, the ones that feel impossible to resolve. Could it be, perhaps, that you're trying to use precise, logical terms while the other person is operating primarily with those ambiguous homonyms? You're just not speaking the same infological language.
Right. Or when you see someone seemingly fall for, I don't know, a misleading advertisement or a political appeal that feels really strong emotionally but lacks actual substance. Maybe this framework helps explain why that happens. Our innate wiring to trust those emotional signals as a sign of credibility makes us vulnerable when that emotionality is faked or presented without real context.
And why is it sometimes so incredibly difficult to change someone's deeply held belief, even when you show them contradictory facts? Well, these ideas about social conservatism, the comfort of aligning with perceived authority, that internalized virtual society of conscience, they offer some powerful potential explanations for that resistance.
How does this lens maybe illuminate the dynamics you see with authority figures, whether it's, your boss, a community leader, a national figure? Understanding authority as fundamentally accumulated social approval and knowing how that approval can be imitated or manipulated, it might change how you evaluate their influence and their claims.
And why does critical thinking, really questioning assumptions, digging deeper, why does it sometimes feel so hard, like swimming upstream? Maybe it's partly because, as the source suggests, our upbringing often programs us more towards faith and authority. Actively prioritizing the usefulness of information over just its source requires conscious effort, maybe even learning that specific technology of doubt.
And maybe the most profound one. What about the source of your own desires, the things you strive for, the values you hold most dear? This perspective really challenges us, doesn't it? To consider how much of that is truly uniquely you versus how much might be the deep, often unconscious programming from those gods walking beside you, your society, your culture, the ancestors who shaped your internal compass without you even realizing it.
It even offers a different way to look at social conflicts, or concepts we think are purely personal, like love or happiness or even something like treason. Seeing them not just as abstract ideas, but as phenomena deeply tangled up with, and maybe even defined by, this whole social informational system of emotions, approval, authority, and collective opinion.
So, we've taken a deep dive today into the infology of emotions. We've seen how emotions, from this viewpoint, are far more than just feelings. They function as a kind of fundamental logic, shaping our communication, influencing how we learn, programming our beliefs and values, defining our relationships, and really structuring our entire societal world.
From the most primitive signals between organisms to the most complex systems of media and authority, it offers a truly unique and maybe sometimes unsettling lens on why we behave the way we do, both individually and collectively.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider.
If the things we want, the values we hold, and the beliefs that guide our lives are so heavily programmed by our social environment, and if the systems of authority that reinforce those programs are so potentially open to manipulation of collective opinion, how much of what you genuinely believe, strive for, or even truly want can you confidently say is authentically your own? And maybe even more challenging, if you wanted to find out, how would you even begin to know?